Alright, so we're going to be taking a look at An Introduction to Gothic by William H. Benett. For those of you who don't know, Gothic is an East Germanic language, which is closely related to English, which is a West Germanic language. However, Gothic and the other East Germanic languages are no longer spoken. They are extinct. Of all the information we have about them, in terms of within the language itself, texts, things like that, there's really not much to go on. Gothic is the one that has the most surviving texts, the most surviving information in general that's written in Gothic. And what survived the most is actually primarily the New Testament. The Gothic bishop, Wulfilas, translated the Bible into Gothic, and unfortunately most of it was lost outside of the New Testament, and a little bit more than that survived, but that's the primary source. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. So this book, by the way, is part of the series, for those who are interested, Introduction to Older Languages, with an introduction to Old Irish, Gothic language, which is this book, Old French, and Old Occitan. If we can see here, there's a manuscript of Gothic, or a picture of a manuscript. Gothic was actually originally written using an alphabet or writing system based on Greek, primarily. Here's another example of a manuscript. There's one or two more in the book. So, starting out, Gothic, by the way, in this book, and in the case of many other books that will, if you're interested in learning Gothic, they tend to transcribe it, so it's written in the Latin alphabet, not the Greek alphabet usually. So it's not too hard to learn to read. Starting here, the first chapter deals with pronunciation. There are a total of 28 chapters. And at the end of the first chapter, you have the Lord's Prayer. And afterwards, it goes into the preliminary exercises, which I believe is 2 to 8. And so they start out fairly short, fairly simple, and then they gradually get a little bit longer. Go ahead and take a look at this. This deals right here with the masculine O declension. For those of you who don't know, Gothic is used also for comparative linguistics, not only for Germanic, but of the other Indo-European languages, such as Latin, Sanskrit, Greek. The grammar is actually very, very similar between these languages, Gothic included. Gothic still has... well, I shouldn't say still. The grammar of Gothic is actually quite similar to modern Icelandic and modern German. So, if you know one of those languages or another Germanic language, it should be a little bit easier to figure out how Gothic functions. So you can see here, this deals primarily with the masculine noun declensions initially. So it's a little hard to go into Gothic with only based on the texts that are available, and only do something like this, like only focusing on one type or portion of the grammar, because it's all just at once, since the texts would be more authentic, or since the texts are based on authentic texts, which tend to be, mixed together. They have different declensions, different conjugations, different verbs that are getting used. So, let's see. At the end of between the first 8 lessons, at the end of each chapter, there's information about a number of things related to Gothic, the history, the Goths themselves, and then moving on to chapter 9, which is here, Gothic Texts. So from that point on, it continues in the same pattern, but it starts moving into information about, for example, here, movable organs of speech. It starts getting into more technical linguistical terminology and how that works. Things like the labial, dental, palatal or velar, labial, velar, stops, affrictives, things like that. A lot more technical linguistical terminology. A side note here, when each text has the custom dictionary below, and it's organized by alphabetically. So that's actually makes it easier to find. There is a glossary at the end, which we'll take a look at here shortly. Underneath some of the texts, there are notes to give you information on a little bit more information on specific points or translations, or where the grammar is a little bit different. Another thing to note about Gothic is that it's, if I recall correctly, it's actually translated pretty much word for word, or in the same order as the Greek, which was the basis for the translation of the Gothic Bible. So the exact word order, how Gothic was, the word order of Gothic initially isn't really that well known. So we get to Gothic Texts, we get to Gothic 28, or 27 here. It deals with the Sicrins, which is not part of the Bible, but I believe commentary, if I recall correctly. And that has the abbreviations, like for God, and they would say Guth, but here they shorten it, Guth, with just G and thorn. That's another thing, by the way. Gothic actually uses the same letter that Old English used to use and that modern Icelandic uses, the thorn, which is a th sound. It doesn't use the eth sound, or it has eth, the sound, th, like in that, which has its own letter as well, but that's actually not used for the transcriptions. Let's see. And here is the alphabet of Gothic. Go ahead and move this in a little bit closer so you can see. So you can see it's actually quite similar to Greek, the Greek writing system, and the letters actually have numerical values as well. Think like Roman numerals. Just going on from there. And you get, here is the final chapter. We have here a text fully in Gothic, but this is a picture of an older text. Unfortunately, it's a little bit faded. It is older, so it can be a little bit harder to see, but it's a little bit more of a challenge. It doesn't look like there's a lot of spacing going on there. A lot of older texts tend to be like that. It deals more here with the a little bit more information about this, the influence of Greek on Gothic, and the writing, particularly the translation. Let's see here. There are exercises in this, by the way, usually phonetically related and whatnot. And then here we have the glossary, starting out. So you get information, you get translations of the words that appear in the book, and it'll tell you where they are, whether it's a masculine noun, whether it's strong or weak, or so on and so forth. And there's a small bibliography at the end. Selected bibliography. So the book is overall just under 200 pages. It's a smaller book. It's not too heavy. I believe it's actually designed a little bit more for classroom-oriented, for people who are particularly interested in comparative linguistics. But you can use it, without being in a classroom, without necessarily the interest in comparative linguistics. If you're only interested in Gothic, it's entirely usable in that way, since the texts do have their own custom dictionary below, or in each case, along with grammatical explanations that come afterwards, where you're given the full patterns, and then you're given words that fit into that pattern. So, for example, you have here the word for place, which is staths, and then you're given the different conjugations, the different declensions, declensions. So that's an introduction to Gothic.